the definition of freedom of speech, because of technologies and other things, is open to greater consternation than the definition of freedom of speech in 1922.
I disagree.
Okay.
I disagree. The definition hasn't changed. The interpretation of that definition changes. The impact of the expression of the freedom of speech changes.
Okay.
Okay. The definition of freedom of speech says I have the freedom to express myself. That has not changed. Not from 1776 to now, that has not changed. However, I agree with you that in 1776, there was no Twitter. I agree with you that the only people that knew George Washington's view on any topic were the people that were in the room when they were discussing the Constitution, unless he wrote it in a book and was able to distribute it. And the Constitution had been adopted by the time an average citizen in Georgia even knew what George Washington thought. And now we can disseminate that to anybody who cares in a millisecond. And so much so, we have to adapt our own human behavior to use new technology, to say, you might want to think about what you write before you write it. And you definitely should think about what you've written before you send it. That was natural when we were writing letters. I mean, because before you put it in the post, but before you put it in the mailbox, we used to read it just to make sure we said it the right way. And because we knew it was going to take them 2 weeks to get across the country, even if we did say something wrong or something changed, we wrote another letter.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Phil, good to
What's
see you
up?
again.
How are you?
I'm freezing, but it's
You know, they do
cold.
have something called heat.
Oh yeah, we do. I'm frugal.
Yeah, me too. I know she got your sweater on. I mean, I feel sorry for your wife. You won't let her turn it up a little bit.
Well, she's downstairs, so she's hot because we keep the downstairs hot because there's a bird down there and we don't want to find a cold bird.
I find it ironic that we're sitting here freezing in Southern California.
Yeah, it is, considering the rest of the country and the weather that it's going through, but it's probably nice. Does your Tesla have that thing that allows you to have it warm before you get in the car, or air condition goes on before you get in the car, so it keeps
I don't
you
have a
separate?
Tesla. I don't have a Tesla.
Okay. No, I know that that in like Las Vegas, they'll keep the inside air conditioned to like 85 degrees, even though it's 120 outside.
Really?
Yeah. So you never get into the car and it's super hot. I may be wrong because my car's got 180,000 miles on it and it's not a T word.
It just goes to show you how we find different ways to waste energy.
Yeah. The discussion of freedom of speech, just some of the things that have been going on with banning books and everything else. Again, I look at that going back to our original conversation 2.5 years ago. It's like, are we going backwards? So,
yeah. And as I've said before, there is no linear, as much as we would love for it to be, social progress does not occur in a linear fashion. So the answer is yes. However you describe it, do revert, or we attempt to revert, or we slip and move backwards, or as a society, we retry things that didn't work to begin with because we have hidden agendas. It's not as if we're trying to go back as much as we're trying to reassert an advantageous position for a group of people.
Yeah, it's like we live in unhardened cement, waiting for it to harden, and it keeps staying soft. So we keep moving. To move forward, you have to have a firm foundation. But I think a lot of the foundation for the social issues is still very infirm.
Yeah, and I think the issue of freedom of speech is a good topic to address how society moves through quicksand, if you will, to to use your own analogy, and finds itself slipping sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
When one narrative seems to disadvantage a group of people, then they find themselves trying to reestablish an alternative narrative. And in doing so, they have to reassert certain environmental changes that we moved away from. Now I will state Elon Musk's name and say that his recent behavior is a perfect example of that type of maneuvering. So much so that in order to do it, you have to be hypocritical in the application of your values. He claims that he was doing society a favor by buying Twitter because this country was based on freedom of speech. And because certain political figures had been suspended from the use of Twitter, he thought it was wrong. And being the richest man in the world, he put his money where his mouth was and decided to buy a major platform in order to correct a wrong. And then because a reporter was able to localize his location and apparently published that location, he then chose to suspend several reporters' accounts, whether they initially violated his privacy or whether they retweeted the information. He found a way to abridge their free speech. Now, don't get me wrong, you can't yell fire in a theater. And there are issues here about privacy and danger to a public individual and how he might have interpreted the danger. But he should not have the autocratic authority of his own to abridge one's freedom of expression because of his personal interpretation of his safety, as opposed to reinstating people who clearly participated in hate speech and ignoring the danger they caused others. There is a difference here in the application of limited speech. And the difference is that someone else should have adjudicated whether or not these people should have lost their right to their accounts rather than the CEO of Twitter.
So let me throw another look at this through another set of glasses. What if this has nothing to do with freedom of speech and everything to do with being having a narcissistic personality disorder?
That is very likely. And I was trying to keep the discussion elevated to the issue of freedom of speech, because the abridgment of that freedom is usually based on individual agendas that stimulate certain people to promote legislative activity or legal limitations that benefit their worldview.
I fully concur with what you're saying regarding freedom of speech. In this case, it's the use of that excuse to continue to maintain a profile that's front and center in the world. I think a lot of the other freedom of speech issues that have come up are not being driven by narcissistic personality disorder. I just think a lot of this is an effort for somebody not to fall off the radar screen in the discussions of other things that are going on. So I fully agree with you on the premises behind freedom of speech and what is happening here. I just think that there's a malignancy that goes along with it in this specific case.
Well, I'll let you characterize it any way you want, whether it's a malignancy, whether it's a personality defect, whether it's a self-promotional issue. None of that matters to me in terms of the motivation. What matters to me is the abrogation of a right that we as Americans have agreed to. And what matters to me is the supposed absolute dedication to that right that was the basis for a $4 billion purchase of a company, and then the insertion of a personality and certain proclivities that allow an apparent easy intrusion in that right on others. And I understand that I myself am having some difficulty here in that I was totally in favor of the suspension of the original accounts for political reasons, because I felt they were dangerous to society, and that these individuals, these public individuals had demonstrated a proclivity toward behavior that harmed others, that they learned how to weaponize the platform. And for that reason, I supported it. I felt that they were a public nuisance, and for that reason, they had lost their protection of that phase of freedom of speech. And so I was against it when he bought the platform just to reinstate them with no consideration of their actions. And yet he turns around and does the same thing with minor consideration of actions based on his personal assessment rather than an overall societal assessment. It would have been different if there had been a administrative committee within the Twitter organization that said these behaviors will not be accepted. But he went in with a battle cry that no one will lose their account because of what they say. And the only way he has tried to justify his action is to express he's scared. But this is the same type of behavior that occurs in many legislatures now in certain states, where they are applying the same tactics on education, K through 12 and higher ed. This is the same, this behavior is similar to the behavior of applying inappropriate pressure on how history books that are being used to teach our children are being written. And if history books won't be bought by school systems because they happen to include certain trigger words, there are several reasons why these trigger words are important to several groups. On the one hand, there's a group of people, of Americans, who believe these trigger words make their children ashamed of being who they are, and therefore they don't even want them to be aware of our history. And I don't buy that. I don't accept that. You know, that's like saying that I should be ashamed that my African heritage included selling slaves to the British. You know, that happened too. And I should be aware of that, if for no other reason than to know that my African brothers and sisters, ancestors, were complicit in my being here. But that is the way it is. And I may be disappointed, but I shouldn't be so overly embarrassed by it that I hide that fact. And if my ancestors were slave owners, and guess what? They were. They had to be slave owners to sell them. That only informs me from a historical perspective that everybody participated in the slave trade. And so if we're going to discuss nuclear fusion theory and critical race theory, I don't understand why one can get in the books and the other can't, but except for the political weaponization of information and information control in order to achieve another agenda.
We don't have just double standards. We got triple and quadruple standards when it comes to freedom of speech. And then I would actually argue that using individual interpretations of the Bill of Rights to get what you want. I mean, these documents that were written 200 years ago are now being interpreted to meet the needs of groups or individuals to get them what they want. And so freedom of speech is being used to define what somebody wants. And all of this is so wide open for interpretation, seems to be wide open for interpretation. And I think this whole thing within Twitter is, again, it's multiple standards. It's the standard that that seemed to be there in the beginning, and now it's a standard that somebody else wants to their benefit. So, I mean, we're deal with it not just in Twitter, but in other situations where multiple standards are being used to get to an individualized or politicized outcome.
Well, I'm not sure I know what multiple standards are. I think there is an array of desired outcomes that tends to influence our behavior when it comes to the application of standards. I don't see different standards. I see different desired outcomes that changes the view, and as you put it, the interpretation of the standard. The standard doesn't change. That's why they call it a standard. But the application of that standard can. For me, it's like building a spacecraft. You know what your engineers discern the requirements they need to get a spacecraft into space, right, and protect its human cargo. And those standards aren't going to change. Nature is not going to change. Those requirements do not change. However, while building that craft, they cheat every day on meeting certain standards. They have to compromise every day. They can only get so much weight up. And so they may know that ideally they need a certain type of material to protect against ionizing radiation. But if they got the ideal, it would be too heavy. They'd never get it off the ground. And so they compromise a little. They may realize that they may have to redesign the shape in order to get their cargo on board of the spacecraft that actually hinders their ability to escape gravity, Earth's gravity, which requires them to have bigger rockets, and they end up coming up with a balance of, this is the same thing we have to deal with in the Constitution.
The definition of freedom of speech in 2022, because of technologies and other things, is open to greater consternation than the definition of freedom of speech in 1922.
I disagree.
Okay.
I disagree. The definition hasn't changed. The interpretation of that definition changes. The impact of the expression of the freedom of speech changes.
Okay.
Okay. The definition of freedom of speech says I have the freedom to express myself. That has not changed. Not from 1776 to now, that has not changed. However, I agree with you that in 1776, there was no Twitter. I agree with you that the only people that knew George Washington's view on any topic were the people that were in the room when they were discussing the Constitution, unless he wrote it in a book and was able to distribute it. And the Constitution had been adopted by the time an average citizen in Georgia even knew what George Washington thought. And now we can disseminate that to anybody who cares in a millisecond. And so much so, we have to adapt our own human behavior to use new technology, to say, you might want to think about what you write before you write it. And you definitely should think about what you've written before you send it. That was natural when we were writing letters. I mean, because before you put it in the post, but before you put it in the mailbox, we used to read it just to make sure we said it the right way. And because we knew it was going to take them 2 weeks to get across the country, even if we did say something wrong or something changed, we wrote another letter.
So when it comes to freedom of speech as defined in the Bill of Rights, it protects the freedom from government interference.
Yes.
In the case of a privately held entity, it really has no bearing, does it?
Well, let's put it this way. We have a right to express ourselves without government interference.
Right.
So the question is, what is government interference? Number one. And number two, what is government protection?
Right.
And is government protection interference? Right. So to answer your question directly, the government is responsible for protecting my right when private institutions interfere with my right. So yes, private institutions can interfere with my right, but they should be held accountable for that. And I look to the government to protect that.
Do you feel that the actions that were taken by Musk to have his own set of standards is a global infraction enough that it warrants escalating beyond just the social media world? Or, I mean, do you feel that it's a violation of somebody's individual rights? Because you've got more than one social media purview that people can join. People can have that same conversation on other purviews. So is he expressing is he controlling freedom of speech and a platform that he owns? And does that make it a violation of somebody's individual rights? Or if they want to have that same conversation, they can move it to Instagram or Facebook or something like that?
So I can't tell if you're trying to set me up or if you truly haven't thought it through and you're looking for an answer.
I've thought it through, and I kind of basically, if you own something and you're not truly violating somebody's individual rights, then you can tell them that, we don't want you any longer. I don't want you as part of this club.
Yes. Well, we all know we can fire our customers, right?
Right.
Okay. I mean, yeah, that's different. I can always fire my, and there are multiple platforms.
Right.
Okay. Right. And nobody said that you have a right to have an account in Twitter.
Right.
Okay.
It's a privilege.
I don't know if it's a privilege. Okay. If you say so, that's fine. But everybody has a right to access an account, right? Now whether the company decides to continue your account for whatever reason, even that reason, but that reason can be adjudicated. You're asking a messy question. I mean, we've already said, or at least I've already stated, that I do not believe that Mr. Musk has the social legal authority to dismiss those accounts for the reasons he stated. And when I look at a freedom of expression, and I do not interpret the behavior of those reporters as being intentionally dangerous or unintentionally dangerous. But then again, I don't know what death threats Elon Musk may have received. I do know he's a public figure, and I'm sure he's antagonized some people. I'm one of them, but I don't know how many of them he's antagonized to the point that he truly has to worry about his own safety. On the other hand, even if I did believe he abrogated an individual's right, it's up to that individual to hold him accountable. It's up to that individual to seek redress.
Right.
And whether other platforms can do it or not, yes, they can do it. I think the question you're asking is, did his behavior rise to the level of a class action type of consequence?
That's basically what I'm asking. I mean,
finish. Let me finish, please. Sorry. And if so, what do you do about it? And so I think that's based. I always believe that the punishment should fit the crime.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I'm interested in his subsequent behavior. I believe this was a mistake. I do not believe it was a mistake worthy of government intervention at this point. I would like to see how he intends to codify this behavior in his company. And if he intends to extend this behavior, I will become I'm already concerned. But I'm not willing to react to this individual action yet. Now, if I were the one who lost the account, I might be thinking differently. But as a person who's concerned about the overall constitutional right, I'm willing to accept a knee-jerk reaction as a mistake and see how he handles it. And I believe in private enterprise, and I believe that you don't provide regulation every time somebody makes a single mistake. It is the repetition of that mistake that results in a perpetual state of denial of rights that requires government intervention, in my opinion.
So when an individual essentially owns an entire company, can they not set their own rules and regulations and change them by, on a whim?
Of course.
and with the ultimate outcome that somebody can decide whether they want to be a part of that company.
Of course.
And so essentially what we're looking at here in this specific case is an individual who is making decisions for themselves that go against comments that he's made previously, which again adds to this level of confusion regarding why the hell did he get involved with this to begin with. So
I don't know if that was a question in there or not, but
no,
okay.
that was a rhetorical question. It's interesting to watch this one situation and see what it will eventually play out to. But
so it is interesting to well, for some it may be interesting to watch. I'm not interested in watching it. I am more concerned with the broader concern of freedom of speech and its application in the national discourse. You mentioned, you alluded that there are many different standards. I suggest there are many different interpretations of a standard, and the standard is you should have the right to express yourself. The standard also should be that the way you express yourself should not endanger other people.
Right.
And but then we have to look at the permutations of that. And frankly, I don't give a damn about Elon Musk and his personal adjudication of freedom of speech, except for how it may impact public sentiment and public expression of opinion, as well as my curiosity on the similarities of the tactics that are being used by him when I compare that to what's occurring in education. When I look at legislators who are putting presidents and deans in compromising situation because they control the public funding, and therefore they have decided, and certain radical elements have decided that they know better about what they teach. And we see it in its extreme when Governor DeSantis wants to hire XGIs that without mental health screening or anything else to teach second and third graders, because he has such a denigrating opinion of education in general that he thinks anybody can teach third graders. I think of the potential danger that his apparent simple proposal raises when it comes to the safety of children. And I don't mean to denigrate GIs, but to just take a person who just finished a tour in Afghanistan and stick them in the classroom, when we know how hard it is for many of them to get adjusted to their families, I think is a load of toast, and for lack of a better word. But that's an extreme expression of a limitation of freedom of speech, because even that suggestion came out of an attempt to control the classroom, to control what's taught in a classroom. And there is this narrative that says our teachers have run amok and our teachers are promoting things that our families do not agree with. And I'm not sure that the evidence supports that narrative, and that the members of the teachers' unions are ultra liberal to a fault, and yet everybody who wants their jobs protected. That's why you join the unions, and there's diversity of thought within unions as well.
So would you suggest that the banning of 41% of the books, the math books in Florida, because they taught critical race theory, would that be considered a lack of freedom of speech?
Absolutely. It's worse. We are banning 41% of the books without any regard to the quality of the content, except for one word.
Yeah.
So who says that the the 59% of the books that they're going to consider are as good as the 41% that they eliminated. And again, I'm not just talking about history books now. I'm talking about any book.
Well, these were math books.
Yeah, see, I just don't get it. And who made that decision? Were these math teachers that made this decision, or were these politicians who can't balance a budget?
Well, that's this whole discussion of using standards and interpretations for political gain.
Yes, this is the same problem once again as we started in our conversation. It's that slippery slope. It's that moving through quicksand. It's that slipping back again. Once again, we are making decisions based on one priority. We're making decisions that have that echo across a spectrum of potential effects based on one priority. The Tea Party tried that too. The Tea Party only cared about a balanced budget. That's all they cared about. And it was not willing to leverage the full faith and potential of the United States Treasury to meet needs that might incur minimum debt or any debt, because the balanced budget was the issue. Now, don't get me wrong, I get it. I at the time it was because apparently nobody else cared about a balanced budget, so we had to make it a hyperbolic type of issue, right? And the real issue was we could not have a bipartisan discussion about Social Security and Medicare and defense. We could not bring those major programs to the table and have a rational discussion. It broke down to me. Even today, this 1 week resolution we have in Congress is about how much money we're paying for social programs and how much money we're paying for defense. And even today, we have a liberal Democrat who proposed a greater increase for defense because of the needs of the nation at this moment and recognizing the needs of defense. But Congress is actually arguing, one extreme is saying, we've got to have at least this percentage increase in defense. And we all know there's dark money in defense that we're wasting. But then they want to point to social programs and graft and stealing and everything else that occurred during COVID, and essentially they want to eliminate many of the social programs, just as many liberals want to eliminate many of the defense programs. We're going to waste money on both sides. We've got to decide what our priorities are on both sides of the ledger. But that means we have to be able to talk about it.
So let me go step back a little bit to the discussion about defining what can be taught and what can be used in universities. The legislative efforts to control what's taught. Isn't that where some of this has come from?
Absolutely. Well, it's an extension of that, right? And what bothers me is, first of all, there is an organized strategy that Republican legislatures have adopted across the country to control content within curricula of universities. That frightens me, because that is the definition of restriction of progress. You only get advances in science, whether it be social science or what is called the hard sciences. You only get advances when people dare to dream, and you can't control the dreams. And we propose theories all the time. And if a theory happens to catch on, but the theory tends to make some uncomfortable, that doesn't mean the theory is wrong.
So the efforts are being made to control the conversation. So it limits the education and propagates a position that maybe the Republican Party supports by taking away education on the opposite conversation. It only allows the position that the Republican Party in this case is supporting. Is that what you feel is the premise for all of these efforts? It's just to
All right, I'm
redirect
sorry.
the
Say that again. I kind of lost you.
All right. So do you feel that the effort to limit what can be taught is to create a one-sided conversation? In other words, if you can't teach women's education, if you can't have a Black Studies class, if you can't have biographies on Frederick Douglass, does that allow that or force that university to teach to position that one party may have?
I'm afraid I don't get that specific.
Okay.
I don't think people think that far.
Okay. That's
Honestly.
interesting. So I went further than they were thinking.
Yes. I think this is a knee-jerk reaction to whatever's irritating them at the moment. Critical race theory seems to be a unifying motivation for many of these legislative maneuvers. And from what I have heard and understand, first of all, critical race theory is thought to inculcate young students and to teach them that white men are sinister and are distrustful and should be ashamed of their history. First, critical race theory does not teach that. That may be the result of what you hear. That may be the result of an individual's reaction to what has occurred. But I'm not here to defend critical race theory. I'm here to say it is wrong to assume that being a politician and controlling the funding of public school systems, by which, by the way, you don't send your children to anyway. It is wrong to use the purse to determine content. I am not saying that every fly-by-night theory should be taught. There are standards that we apply, and there's only so much we can teach anyway, But the basis of these movements begins with the age-old lack of respect for the opponent, and they have made teachers' unions and teachers the opponents. And then they put them up against family values and say that what you're teaching isn't consistent with my family values. And suddenly now the public education system must teach according to individual family values or the family values of the predominant demographic in a community. When I went to school, first of all, when I went to when I went to the segregated schools didn't teach my family values because they were dominated by the white race. And when I went to an integrated school, it didn't teach my family values. My family values came from my family. My education came from the schools. My technical education came from schools. And part of that technical education is history and sociology. And whether we like what they learn in those disciplines is immaterial. We have to learn how to integrate what we learn in school, be it public or private, with our own individual values.
Don't forget to join us for part 2 of this conversation next week.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.